and welcome back to Determi-Nation, a podcast about Indigenous sovereignty, self-determination, Indigenous brilliance, and the people who embody them. I'm your host, Darrah Blackwater Yanishya. Bishbacha inishle, dotsena jeni bashish chin, ado bishbacha idashiche, ado taj ini dashanale. I was really excited when I heard that today's guest would agree to speak with me about spectrum issues. Antony Royal is the CEO of the interim Maori Spectrum Commission. For anyone who isn't familiar, the Maori are the Indigenous people of New Zealand. Antony has played a key role in spectrum negotiations between Maori leadership and the New Zealand government officials. Earlier this year, these negotiations led to a Memorandum of Agreement, or a Memorandum of Understanding, MOA or MOU, which is essentially a document that records the compromises of each side of an issue. So this is sort of like a treaty, but not as big of a deal as a treaty. In fact, the Maori do have a treaty with New Zealand called the Treaty of Waitangi, and the Maori have asserted that spectrum is encompassed in their treaty as a natural resource. Does that sound familiar? It should. That's the same argument that I'm making on the United States side for Native nations within present-day America. And the governments, the colonial governments on both sides, the United States government and the New Zealand government, are treating it very similarly, where they're just not recognizing Indigenous rights to spectrum or spectrum sovereignty. Nevertheless, I was interested to talk to Antony about the Maori's struggle for spectrum rights because they're a few steps ahead of Native nations in the United States on this journey to the acknowledgement of Indigenous spectrum rights. As you'll hear, the government of New Zealand still generally resists the idea of spectrum sovereignty for their Indigenous people, but it does concede that spectrum is important to self-determination and that the Maori should be able to use some spectrum for their networks and broadcasting. So through this document, the Memorandum of Agreement, they have gained some rights to their spectrum, the Maori people. So I don't want to drag on with this intro. I really just want to get to the meat of this conversation because Antony was such a great guest and we learned so much from each other. So I'm really excited for you to hear it. Here's Antony Royal.
Kia ora, Darrah. My name's Antony Royal. So the first name and the last name are English words and the middle two are Maori words. And so I come from a family where my father was Maori and my mother was Pākehā or English European by descent. And I come from quite a large family, particularly on my father's side. He was one of 13 kids and we grew up on a farm just about an hour south of Auckland on the coast. Back in the days when it was not at all encouraged for Māori to speak their own language. In fact, at school, the kids were caned for speaking Te Reo Māori, our Māori language. And so my grandparents brought up my father's generation not knowing our language, and there's been of course, a lot of regeneration over the years, where the Māori language is spoken much more widely now than it was back in the days when my parents were growing up. We have a farm here, about 300 odd acres on the coast. It's the very last piece of continuously occupied Māori land on this coast. So land is pretty precious to us. But I was brought up in our capital city, Wellington, as a kid, and I became interested in engineering, which was quite strange because most of my family were all school teachers or educationists of some kind, and my father played a big role in education for Māori inside Aotearoa, our country, and so I was kind of an outlier. I decided I wanted to do mechanical engineering and went to university and then decided I didn't like thermodynamics and then swapped because there was this newfangled computer stuff that was coming out, and I thought that looked exciting. And so I swapped and decided to do electrical engineering instead, and that's what I trained in. And I kind of fell into telecommunications along the way. So that's my background is actually as an engineer. I actually trained as a process control engineer in paper machines and computers that managed paper machines. And my first job was for an American company called Accuray out of Ohio. Columbus, Ohio was the headquarters. And I traveled with them mostly and through Asia doing project management work. And then after a number of years doing that, came back to New Zealand, retrained in IT, and then got involved with Te Wānanga, which is one of the 3 Maori universities here in New Zealand. And we did a lot of work in technology and looking to get more Maori involved in technology and in normalizing the use of information technology, particularly in homes. So we had a lot of students that had come to Te Wānanga to learn more about their history and about their language and other topics. And we normalized it by sending computers back to their homes. They had to have a computer as part of enrollment. And as a result, we've seen quite a big change in Māori and engagement with computers.
Nice.
So yeah, that was how I kind of ended up at Te Wānanga, and we had one of our kaumātua, one of our elders there, one of our leaders, a fellow by the name of Whatarangi Winiata, who was a professor, and he said, look, we're getting involved in this fight for spectrum. Can you come and get involved in that? And that was way back in 2000, and I've been involved in it ever since.
Oh, wow. I want to ask you so many questions about the origin of, these spectrum rights for the Maori people, but I want to go back a little bit and just sort of recognize that the generations that you're describing, you said that your grandparents were fluent speakers and they were the ones who were at school encouraged not to speak Maori. And then, so your parents didn't speak fluent?
No, that's right. My grandparents were fluent.
Yeah.
But they did, because of the way that our society was at that time, they thought it was necessary for their kids to grow up learning English, not Māori. And so it was, they were never taught their language when they grew up. Of course, my father subsequently did when he went to university. And he was one of the first in our family to go to university. Of course, we've had quite a number since then. But my father and his generation just saw education as being the key, and that's what he dedicated his life to.
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly how it's gone in my family as well, where my grandparents were the ones who went to boarding schools, these, government church-run boarding schools, and they were the ones who were, punished brutally for speaking their language. And so they didn't pass it on because they wanted my father's generation to speak English and be able to, fit in and succeed in the white man's world. So, yeah, it's interesting just, being an ocean away.
The same.
Yeah. And having these same parallels of how colonization has affected our communities and kind of being on the same healing timeline as well of like our generations. It sounds like the Maori have done incredible things with education and bringing that language back to the children as well, which I love. I love reading about that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Education has been the key, and that just opens opportunities for others, beyond education, well, as a subject. And we're very keen, and that's my kind of areas in the technology is actually how do we bring more Māori into the technology space, because it affects what we do on a day-to-day basis. So that's a long journey, and we've got a long way to go, but we have made significant progress over the last couple of decades.
Yeah. So switching back to what we're here to talk about, telecommunications and specifically spectrum rights for the Maori people, which has been such a fascinating journey in New Zealand. First, I'm hoping you can just lay a bit of foundation for us. I think a lot of the people who listen to this maybe have some familiarity with the way that the United States government is organized when it comes to Indian affairs. We have the Department of Interior, who we have the Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland, the first Native person, and she's a Native woman, to be at the helm of the Department of Interior, where our Bureau of Indian Affairs and so much of our federal Indian law policy lives in that. And then we also have these other entities that are like the Federal Communications Commission that does a lot of this telecommunications work and houses the spectrum policy. And then for us, those agencies have to kind of figure out. And then we have the Department of Agriculture, which gives a lot of money for broadband grants, and some of that gets over to tribes as well. So I'm curious for the Maori and for the Maori government as well as the government of New Zealand, like what does that look like as far as their intergovernmental relations?
Well, that's fascinating how you describe it, because it's somewhat similar here. So we had a couple of key institutions within inside government. One was the Maori land space, and that was about the court. There was a court that was set up specifically to manage Maori lands, but its original intention was to actually take lands from Maori and make it available to the settlers here.
Wow.
That was their original intention. Of course, over the years, that's changed now, whereas its intention now is to manage Maori lands so that we're dealing with some of the effects that colonization has had over the years. So, particularly in colonization and of the English brand of colonization, where land was assigned to individual persons, there was no ability to recognize communal land, which of course more Māori land was communally owned. So of course when the British came here, they said, oh no, we have to chop this up, put these imaginary lines on it, and then what we have to do is assign who actually owns the bits in between these imaginary lines. And they put a limit of number of 10 people that were allowed on each of these pieces of land. So there was a whole process of disenfranchising Māori through a whole range of different mechanisms, including saying things like you're having to have only 10 people on a allocated to a piece of land. In some cases, they didn't even manage to identify who those 10 people were. So it's so that was one of the key government levers. There was also the Maori Affairs Department, which was set up some years ago, which was to manage Maori affairs. For many years, of course, it was headed up by Pākehā or Europeans to manage Maori stuff. And then, of course, over time, that's changed, and where Maori are now heading that up. And that's the Maori Affairs Department doesn't exist any longer, but there is what they call Te Puni Kōkiri, which is the Ministry of Maori Development, which is fundamentally run by Maori, but it is a government organisation with a view to trying to deal with a lot of Maori issues, and they've had quite a bit of success over the years, but they are still a government organisation. So, I mean, they have been helpful in the conversation around telecommunications, quite helpful over the years. The way that we protested telecommunications was for us to go to another government organisation which was set up by the government, called the Waitangi Tribunal, which is it's like a court. And I'm certainly not an expert on this, but it has the ability to hear grievances on behalf of Māori, both traditional and contemporary. And they sit and listen to the evidence and then come up with a recommendation. Unfortunately, it is not enforceable. It only becomes a recommendation, and the government can elect to listen to the findings of the court or not. which
Yeah,
in the year 2000 they didn't, of course, but that's the beginning of the story.
sure. So this is where I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because this was just baffling to me as I was doing research for this interview. I was reading the memorandum of agreement that was passed in February for telecommunications and Maori Spectrum, and it really, my blood just started boiling because in my research, I've been researching this for a couple years now, and the Maori treaty has kind of been like this like golden egg of Indigenous spectrum rights. And then reading in this memorandum of agreement, I mean, it's great in so many ways. And I know that so many people worked hard on it, and it's really a beautiful document. And it literally says, I don't want to pronounce it wrong. Is it the Waitangi Tribunal?
Waitangi Tribunal.
Waitunga,
Yeah.
Waitangi. So it literally says, the Waitangi Tribunal has recognized that's essentially for us, it would be like spectrum is a natural resource. It falls under, is it taonga?
Taonga, yes,
Taonga.
treasures.
So yeah,
Taonga.
treasures, natural resources, the same word that water rights and education and children and heirlooms and artifacts and land fall under. It's saying we recognize that the Waitangi Tribunal sees it as a natural resource, as a thing, treasure that belongs to the Maori inherently. And we're not going to recognize that. So we're going to do all of these other things instead. And it really just threw me for a loop because that wasn't what I was expecting to read. But like I said, it still is progress. It's just not, the big thing of, yeah, we recognize that Maori have inherent rights to this natural resource that's on their land. So, yeah, tell me a little bit about how it got to that, about the coming to the memorandum of understanding that was passed in February, and your role in it, what you think about it, all of the above.
So there was a treaty signed in 1840 between the Maori chiefs of New Zealand and the British Crown, which there were a number of articles in there which guaranteed, sovereignty for Maori, but also allowed a level of governorship for the British government at the time. And primarily at that time when that treaty was signed, the British subjects were pretty much in the minority and confined to the cities, where there was quite a bit of lawlessness breaking out amongst all of these immigrants. And of course, Māori wanted the British government to deal with it. So we're happy for the government to exert some degree of governance over there, particularly around the cities and managing all of these immigrants. So Māori at that time didn't see the treaty as handing over, the whole country, holus bolus, to the British Crown. And of course, there was a lot of difficulties around the translation of the treaty. And once again, I'm no expert in this.
Sure. Yeah, we have
But
those
there
same
is,
things.
there was a significant treaty which the government then went and ignored for quite some time. So a lot of our conversations always lead back to the treaty and saying, well, this was the nature of the agreement. This is how the government was formed, and this is upon the basis in which this government was formed. And so let's look back at the intent of what was being attempted to be done back in 1840. And so that relates to the conversation around telecommunication spectrum, because this is a taonga or a treasure or a natural resource that existed at the time of the treaty signing. Now, some would say, well, why should we listen to Māori around, telecommunication spectrum back in 1840? Because, they didn't know it existed then. And our argument is, well, actually, we did know about not necessarily telecommunications, we certainly knew about spectrum. And it was never quantified. In fact, the British never knew about spectrum until, the 1890s, when it was quantified by that fellow called Hertz. So it's a spurious argument to say that Māori shouldn't have it because they didn't know about it in 1840. Well, nor did the Crown either. So, but that's the basis of much of our arguments. And what we've been trying to do as a country is to recognize the wrongs that have been done since that treaty was signed, and attempted to do what they're calling treaty settlements, which are, the major Maori tribes have been settling with the Crown on this. But what they're settling for is 5% maximum of what they've lost over the years.
Mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, what we're trying to do is trying to find a way forward.
Yeah.
Now, my personal opinion is that when we come to telecommunications spectrum, the Crown doesn't want to recognise those rights, because immediately, if you say, okay, well, that's a natural resource that we agree was included in the Treaty of Waitangi, then that opens up discussions around the other natural resources: water, gold, silver, petroleum, and I think that's that'll be too hard for the government to deal with at this particular point in time.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, you're right. The MOU says that the Crown, our government, does not seeing this as a treaty settlement, but they are looking for an arrangement that we can both work with and that we can move forward on.
Mm-hmm.
And this arrangement you will also see in that MOU is that this arrangement we're putting in place does not extinguish in any way any rights that we may in the future exert in terms of these rights to natural resources. So we're not giving away our rights, but we have agreed to figure out how to work together to move forward on this. Otherwise, we'll be waiting another generation or two to make some progress.
Yeah, that sounds
so that's how we do it.
Yeah, good lawyering right there. Well, let's talk about the agreement. So it does not recognize, broad, vast Maori rights to, all spectrum, like I personally think it should, but it does do a lot of good things. And so before we really dive into the Memorandum of Understanding, can you tell me, you gave us you did a good job of laying the background of how we got here. And I'm curious just sort of how you specifically got here. You're the CEO of the interim help me here. Interim Maori
Spectrum
Commission. Okay.
Yeah.
And so what is the commission for? What does it do? What's the purpose? And what is your role in all of that?
Well, maybe I'll start from this journey, which for me started way back in 2000, 1999, 2000. 1999 was when what they call the Y776 Waitangi Tribunal submission was made. And at that stage, the government said, after the tribunal came back and said, yes, we think that Māori do have interest in the spectrum. The government said at the time, no, we don't recognise that, but what we'll do is we'll give you the rights to buy some spectrum, and we'll give you a 5% discount, and we'll give you a little bit of money, and we'll set up a trust to go ahead and develop that. So that was in 2000. It was called the Maori Spectrum Trust, which was renamed Urakitika Trust. And that trust then went on, and it didn't have a lot of money. It had to raise a bunch of funds to buy the spectrum, but it managed to attract investors from overseas to actually start up New Zealand's third mobile network. And that mobile network was called 2 Degrees Mobile. And actually, some of the major investors were from Trilogy International, based out of Seattle, John Stanton, who had been involved in working with Indigenous peoples in Alaska around wireless. I think it was called Western Wireless back at the time. He became involved, and it was directly through Māoris interest in spectrum that this third mobile network operator is up and running. And in fact, it's actually being sold right at the moment to an Australian company. But it's been very successful in challenging the incumbents, which was Telecom New Zealand and Vodafone. And we used to have one of the highest rates of mobile phone calling in the world, because we had this really comfortable duopoly who did everything from ensuring regulation was in place to prevent third mobile operator coming, to the agreements that they had. It took a lot of time, a lot of changes in regulation, until we actually managed to get to the point where I've got this new network operator. Now our mobile costs are considerably less. And so the value of that has been billions of dollars to the New Zealand economy as a direct result of Maori getting involved in telecommunications. Now, our direct benefit as a result hasn't been commensurate with the benefit that the whole of New Zealand has received. And so, this was a lot of work and effort by a number of Maori over many years, no pay to get there. But we've achieved a great result. And so we use that as an example to government to see, if you work with us instead of against us, we can actually make some changes and bring value to the whole of New Zealand. This is not just about value to Māori. This is about value to the whole of New Zealand. So that was back in 2000. That was the 3G spectrum, 2100 megahertz spectrum. And can I just say, there is another conversation to be had about spectrum auctions, but I'll come back to that.
Okay.
And then in 2013, the government decided it was going to auction off the 700 megahertz spectrum. We went to the government and said, you can't do that without reference to Māori. And they said, oh yeah, no, after lots of discussions, they said, no, we're not going to give you any spectrum. But what we will do is that we'll set up a $30 million digital development fund for investing in Māori companies. And I said, well, if you're going to give that to Māori, give it to Māori, don't give it to yourselves. So, which the government immediately did. It gave itself $700 million to be managed by a government department. And because I was the one that was kicking out the most fuss about it, I ended up becoming the chair of the Ministerial Advisory Committee on that. And we managed to get some of that funding out in the hands of Māori companies so that they can start to innovate and develop the technology. Some of them have been quite successful. So that was the 4G spectrum. Then, of course, we come to 5G. And 2019, the government came along and said, well, we're going to auction off the 3.5 gig band for 5G. Expect you're going to have to say something about that. And we said, yes. So we got into a room with a whole bunch of ministers. And the minister said, well, we're getting sick of you coming and telling us every time we have an auction that that you disagree with it. We said, well, we're getting sick of it too. So they said, well, how about we come up with an arrangement we can both live with? We said, well, we'll see what that looks like, and we'll work together to try and figure that out. And that's what we've done in the last 2 years, is we've been negotiating an agreement which culminated in the MOU, which was signed in February this year, which was about setting up an arrangement in which we could not necessarily settle treaty issues, but we could come up with something that will benefit both Māori and the rest of New Zealand, and that's what we're doing. So, as part of the process, we had to set up an interim body to actually hold spectrum. So we set up a trust, appointed the trustees appointed me as the CEO, with the idea being that part of our work is to transition to a new entity which will be enshrined in legislation. And we want legislation to enshrine it because we don't want to be left to the political, winds that happen. We have a 3-year election cycle, and some things get rolled back, depending upon which party is in power. We want this to be a permanent entity and to make sure that we have some long-term sustainable goals in place. So that's what I'm doing now, is heading up the interim Maori Spectrum Commission. We've got a number of things we've got to do. One is to complete the negotiation, get legislation in place, and one of the immediate things we're doing right now is working on what the governance arrangements might look like for a new entity. We're also starting up our innovation platform, which is to look to how we can innovate over 5G and other wireless technologies, and how do we actually get more training and capability built within inside Māori in the telecommunications sector. So that's what we're doing, and hopefully next year we'll have a new organisation. But in the meantime, I'm starting to ramp this up and getting some of our expertise, particularly around 5G, but other wireless technologies, IoT, and a whole range of other things. We want to get Māori across all of these technologies.
Cool. I love that work, and I love the vision. I have a couple questions for you about Maori governance, because if it's anything like how tribes are and tribal governments are in America, there's sometimes some tension with, who do you talk to and who gets to make the decisions. Because like for us, the Dene, where I'm from, the Navajo Nation, we never had a president. We had lots of different groups that were all kind of governed by themselves, and then those people would get together and have conversations. And we've always been a matriarchy, and now we have this democracy that was set up by the the colonial government, by the United States. And they kind of said, like, okay, Navajo Nation, you're a democracy now, you're going to have a president, this is how it's going to be, here's your constitution. And so our president is Jonathan Nez, and I say this all the time, no shade to the Navajo Nation government. They're doing a great job in a lot of different ways. And it's not how our government looks now is not how our governments looked for thousands of years before that. So I'm just curious, it's kind of a rabbit hole here, but as you're doing this and as you're having these conversations with Maori leadership, what does the Maori government even look like? Is it like, does it reflect the New Zealand government, where it's sort of this three-branch government, or is it lots of different leaders, and what is that like?
Let's just say that it doesn't yet reflect what we'd like it to look like. We have a one-house parliament, which is primarily elected representatives through the democratic system. We do have a number of Maori members of parliament that are elected through Maori wards or Maori electorates. And so they are elected on that basis, but they're there as part of the parliamentary representation process, not the Maori representation process. So it is very challenging. If you looked back at how Māori organised themselves previously, they didn't have this natural big tribes kind of approach. They were mostly what we call hapu, which were kind of sub-tribes, and would form alliances, from time to time, and then they'd join together for specific things. And it wasn't until the government, when it started thinking about, treaty settlements process, that it said, well, now you actually have to have an organisation who represents your interests. You have to have the mandate. And they've set up these things called PSGEs, post-settlement governance entities, which is effectively a trust type of structure, which has a board. They're elected by the people, and they're the ones that have the mandate to be able to negotiate on behalf of that tribe. And there are, a lot of tribes in New Zealand, some big and some small. I'm chair actually one of the tribes in the Hauraki area. And so you have these tribes that have these governance entities, and some of them historical, some of them are through this treaty settlement process. And then you have as well some representative bodies which are at the next level. So there's an iwi chairs forum. So that is a forum of iwi chairs that get together. They meet every couple of months and they discuss issues that are of interest nationally and generally interact with the government over a number of these issues. For example, over natural resources and water, how we're going to manage water
Hmm.
on an ongoing basis. But not
Okay.
every iwi is necessarily a member of that forum. Then we have Maori national Maori organisations who are pan-Maori organisations that are not necessarily linked to a tribe. And an example for that is the New Zealand Maori Council, which is a statutory body set up many years ago, who represents Maori right throughout the country and have done good work over the years. And then of course we have our urban Maori organisations who represent those Maori who tend to live in city areas and urban areas, and who don't necessarily have their links back to their tribes because they've lost them along the way, or they have very strong links because this is where they're closest living to, compared with many of the iwi are based in rural areas. So it's a very, very complex area, and it's very challenging to get across all of these governance entities and to bring everybody aboard, and in particular on a topic that is highly complex.
Sure.
Technically complex. It's very complex trying to describe to people telecommunications, how it works, how the technology works, how the spectrum management works, how the rights work. It's and what the future looks like. It's very challenging. So that's been very difficult. I'd have to say we've been really successful to date in getting all of the organisations we're working with together across this. But I have to say that part of this is down to trust, because it takes decades of work in this space to get people to get to know you. And I mean, New Zealand is a small country, so that's really helpful in that regard, because we build all these personal relationships and you build up trust over time. And that really helps with the group that we have together and all the personal relationships that everybody has, helps to build a cohesive, that's not to say everybody just agrees with us. We do have our detractors, but fundamentally, in terms of where we're heading, it's pretty much unanimous that this is the direction that we need to head. We're probably less coherent in terms of how those structures and how control is going to be exercised long term. So big challenging area. It's very difficult, but you've got to have the subject matter experts who are well known and trusted in the space, that can bring everybody along.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds like you and your team have taken that challenge on and have really tried to see this through. Um, Going back to the agreement now, I'm curious what it is, this memorandum of understanding. Like I said, it's a beautiful document, and it's very obvious that a lot of contributors were very thoughtful about what to put into this thing. And you were one of those. You're one of the parties to this memorandum of agreement. So I'm curious just what you think of it, what you're most proud of, what you would change, and what you think is so great about this thing that so many people have obviously poured their hearts and minds into.
Look, it was definitely a team effort. We had a number of people, and it took 2 years to put this together.
Hmm.
Um, Mostly because COVID intervened and we had to do everything by Zoom, which wasn't ideal because fundamentally we're a face-to-face people. Fundamentally, we like to get in a room and spend time with people. And when we call a national hui or a national conference on this, we like to spend a couple of days and get together and live together for that time to actually really tease these things out. And that wasn't possible during COVID.
Hmm.
We pretty much had to do everything online. And we had a range of people who knew a lot of this. So our chair, Piripi Walker, he has a long history, not just in telecommunications, but in the fight around Māori television, FM, AM radio stations. This has a long history, and he has a long history in working in this area. And we have others that bring different skills to bear around the particularly around the treaty space and around relationships and how they should be portrayed with inside the agreement. The bit that I'm probably I managed to spend the most time on was the technical side, really understanding what are the drivers for government from a spectrum management perspective, but also understanding the mobile network operators and all the other users of spectrum, and understanding where potentially our place in this ecosystem could fit, and what are the opportunities for us right in front of us. So we've been very, very keen to get ourselves skilled up on spectrum issues of spectrum management. Which requires, quite a degree of technical know-how. We've brought in people to help us, and we're not afraid to do that. Our spectrum technician specialist is from Sri Lanka. He's been in New Zealand for quite some time. Absolutely loves working with us, and he's in another one's contributed. We have people contributed from all walks of life, from many Pākehā or Europeans have supported us, and we have a vision and a journey that people buy into, and that's what it's about, is actually buying into a vision, and we get a lot of help as a result of doing that. We're not here to make money for shareholders. We're here because we're making a difference for our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. And when you kind of articulate that kind of vision, you get a lot of help from a lot of quarters.
Very cool.
So yeah, I know that there was the technical side. It really needed to be done. I can't say that we didn't get everything we asked for. It was a negotiation after all.
Sure.
But I'm sure there'll be opportunities for further discussion further down the track. But I think that we have sufficient to get on with the job.
Getting into the technical bit, I'm really glad that you said that that's the part that you're most interested in and involved in. So one of the things that the Memorandum of Understanding says is that they have a goal to grow Maori capabilities and participation in spectrum-related industries. And then they have an agreement, the Crown agrees to manage Maori spectrum, and there's an ongoing allocation of national spectrum as the Maori need. And so I'm curious, because we're very much going through a very similar thing in the United States. We had in 2019, or 2020 rather, they opened a tribal spectrum rural priority window. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but essentially what they did was the Federal Communications Commission said, hey, tribes, if you want to apply for the 2.5 gigahertz band of spectrum, we will review your application. And if we approve it, then you can have this band on your land. But it's only available for rural tribes. So any urban tribes or tribes in urban areas were not eligible. You can imagine why, because that's very valuable spectrum in urban areas. But a lot of tribes, I think it was over 300 tribes. We have 574 federally recognized tribes, and then there's more that are state recognized or who have never sought recognition. But I think over 300 tribes were able to secure their rights to this 2.5 gigahertz spectrum. And now there's different rounds of funding going out for them to build their networks on this 2.5 gigahertz band, which is awesome. Obviously, it's great spectrum for rural areas. But I think now is a time when tribes are kind of, specifically the administrators, are trying to figure out what managing that looks like. And as we, it begs the question, as we're asking for more and more spectrum rights and attaining them, what does it look like for a tribe to regulate spectrum, and what kind of capacity do we have for that already, and what does that look like to gain that? And so it sounds like one of the promises that the Crown makes is to really help. I never like saying help tribes do whatever or help Maori do whatever, but to teach what they know about regulating spectrum so that maybe the Maori will be able to take that on in the future. Is that the idea, or do you think that the Crown will continue to manage that? Is that something that the Maori even want, or are they happy with the New Zealand government doing that?
I see it a bit differently. I see this as an opportunity for us to help teach the government how to
Mm,
regulate spectrum better,
love it.
because there are some things that we can do that the government would find difficult to do. So we don't have things in New Zealand like, for example, the CBRS band, which the US has, the shared spectrum bands. We see shared spectrum as a great opportunity for Māori to become involved in, and I would imagine the tribes in the US as well would be that would be a great opportunity to actually get involved in how you manage spectrum. Because just remember that, well, this is how I see it, is that there is spectrum that's set aside exclusively for us,
Mhm.
but that doesn't get it. That doesn't lock us out of all the other spectrum that's available.
Sure.
So my view is that you need to build capability around what spectrum management actually means, and to then start to think about, well, this is how they do it today. How should we be doing it in the future? So
Mhm.
one of the things in our MOU that we've carved out is an ability to have direct influence over spectrum management right across the board, not just Māori spectrum, but all of spectrum in New Zealand. And that's our ability to be able to do it, to build our own capability around analysis of spectrum policy, to be able to advocate directly on it, to get early advance warning of what's actually happening in the spectrum work, to contribute to the government's work. And if we fundamentally disagree with what the officials would propose, we have the ability to directly put our views in front of the minister.
I
So
love that.
that's not to say that the minister wouldn't make a decision which would be entirely favourable on our side, but what we're saying is that we don't want to participate in a system which had previously been at work, where what they would do is decide upon what they think the spectrum policy will be. They put it out, a consultation, every man his dog sees what you like, you go into the mix, and then then they decide what happens with it, and they summarize for the minister what the feedback is. That for us isn't good enough. What we want to be able to do is put our views directly in front of the decision maker. So that's
Yeah.
really fundamental.
I really love that. And it's not something that I've thought too much about before, because I think sometimes we get so caught up in that is so big picture. And as tribes, I think it's really easy for us to just, try to chip away at these problems. And what you're saying is zoom out and carve away at the origin of it. I use the analogy all the time for people who don't work in the spectrum field, or really understand that essentially what the 2.5 gigahertz band priority window was. My criticism of it is that they took away a cookie and they're offering us a crumb if we fill out this application. And what you're saying is, well, let's oversee the baking process, and
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, I love that. That's very big picture, and I think, I hope that that's able to, yeah, I guess it's very similar to the treaty or the Waitangi Tribunal, where nobody is mandated to listen to us as Indigenous peoples, and a lot of times they don't. But what you're saying is, let's get in the position where we can offer our insight at a higher level, and maybe they'll listen and maybe they won't, but they'll have our voices in their head from the very beginning, and then they can choose from there.
So absolutely, yeah, I would build capability to provide really good spectrum analysis and advice.
Mm-hmm.
And if you could do that under the umbrella of a collective right across the country, that'll be way more powerful. I mean, I know the FCC is a very powerful organisation in your country, and we don't have quite the same structure here. We're much smaller for a start. But the principle is, let's start at the top level and saying, what is the basis upon which spectrum is allocated? And let's have some really clear views about how that should be allocated and on what basis. Is this about making money? Is this about serving the people?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and if you do that, then you're not going to get oh, the cookie right from the very beginning. But you can actually start to figure out a strategy. Is what's beyond 2.5? What next?
Mm-hmm.
If you got 2.5 sorted, what would you do next?
Mm-hmm.
And so starting to think about these bigger strategies, because you might say, well, actually 2.5 is not enough because we actually need to have that paired with some 600 or some 700.
Sure.
And you need to be able to have, those conversations both at a principle level in terms of who should get access, but also at a technical level around, well, here's why you would need, 600 to be paired with, 2.5 or whatever.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to circle back for the people listening, both of them. CBRS is spectrum that lots of different people can use. So it's spectrum that is open. And the problem with it comes when lots of people are trying to use it at the same time. It's kind of like lanes of traffic getting gummed up, and it becomes where you can't send signals. But if that's not an issue, there are these open lanes that are open for people to use. And, if there's just two cars on it and no speed limit, then that's really good for those two cars. And so when we're talking about CBRS spectrum, we're talking about spectrum that the Maori could use, but if they're using it and a lot of other people are using it at the same time, then maybe it's not a great solution. And so it can be and sometimes isn't, depending on what's going on in the world that day. So one other thing I wanted to come back to is near the beginning of this interview, you talked about the government's argument, the New Zealand government's argument against Maori spectrum rights being, well, they didn't know that they were even there when this treaty was signed in 1843. And so, why should we recognize those rights today? Because you didn't know that they were there. And to which you said, well, the New Zealand government, the Crown didn't know they were there either. But I love bringing that back to what you just said about, overseeing the baking process and being able to influence spectrum policy across the entire country. I think that those are completely relevant, that the Maori did know what spectrum was. And I make this argument all the time because the FCC has said the same thing to me when I've questioned why Indigenous spectrum rights aren't recognized. They say, well, they didn't know that they were there when the treaties were signed. And I say, well, neither did you. But, we have observed this land for thousands and thousands of years. And, sunlight is spectrum. Sunlight is something that we have been feeling on this land for thousands of years. And then just understanding communication through waves, understanding whales, understanding bats. These are things that we have seen, and these are relatives, things that we know. I was at an education conference once with these Indigenous elders who were presenting, and I've told this story so many times, but I love it so much, where they were talking about whether to bring a computer into their tribal headquarters when computers were new. And if that was something that was okay to innovate in that way, or whether they needed to stick to tradition. And these elders sat with the computer for a while, and then they came back and they said, these are relatives, these are thunder beings. We know the beings that are running through this thing, so we can welcome them into our community because these are relatives, we know them. And so, that argument of like, well, Maori don't know what spectrum is, it's a very antiquated argument that is very much like how our land was taken in the first place, of like, well, savages can't own land because they're not people. It's like, and another thing is, when I was in DC, someone asked me once, I told them what I do, and they said, well, what are Indians going to do with the internet? And it's sort of that same line of questioning thrown at us of like, well, what are Indians going to do with spectrum? It's like, well, a lot. Let me tell you, got an hour. So yeah, so I really love all
Look,
of the
a lot of
ideas.
our elders would say exactly the same thing,
Sure.
that, telecommunications is only just another manifestation of natural resource that we've known about for centuries.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly.
There is one area that we haven't covered, and that is the whole spectrum auction process, which unfortunately, we had a hand in here in New Zealand. I'm not sure if you know that story.
Nope.
Um, so in 1989, the New Zealand government passed the Radio Telecommunications Act, which allowed for the first country in the world to actually auction spectrum to create these management rights. And so we were the very first country ever to auction off spectrum. And it was actually based upon an economic theory by the fellow's name, Ronald Close, I think it is, who had actually presented to the FCC many years earlier the concept of auctioning spectrum. He basically said the most efficient way of using a scarce natural resource is to give it to those who would pay the most for it,
Hmm.
which is how the auctions came about. And so New Zealand went ahead and auctioned off a spectrum, and then the FCC followed pretty quickly. There are papers actually showing New Zealand experiment when they were advocating at FCC, and then of course all across the world they went off to that. Now we actually argued that spectrum auctions are not necessarily the best way to do that, and this is something that we I think continue will have an eye on, and that is how best to manage our national resources, and is spectrum auctioning spectrum to the likes of mobile network operators at large dollars, is that the best way to actually manage it? What are the outcomes that we're actually looking to seek? So I think there's still a lot of conversation to be had around how best to allocate spectrum. That's certainly something we're going to be thinking about in the next few years, is looking at the Maori view about how do you manage the spectrum resource. Of course, when it went into courts, and Maori were poo-pooed at the time. Well, I don't know whether that's a colloquialism. I don't know whether you know that, but
Yeah.
but we're denigrated at the time for saying, oh well, if you're claiming spectrum, you'll be claiming sunlight next. And of course, my uncle at the time in court said, well, if the government goes to regulate and create private property rights around sunlight, then yes, we will be having our
Sure.
hands up
Yep.
and saying, So it was this whole private property rights construct that actually kicked this all off. I mean, the positive, I guess, is that we are in this position now of being able to effectively argue for some of those property rights. But the very concept of moving away from a government managed on behalf of the people kind of approach to, oh, look, we've got this resource and we're going to maximize its dollars out of it, is fundamentally the wrong way to be looking at this. So anyway, that's
Yeah.
something we're going to be thinking about next while.
Very cool. Well, I'm really looking forward to seeing how this develops. This is really helpful to me as someone who's just been fascinated by, all of this information and what's happening around spectrum rights. And it really does seem to be a global movement. I've been keeping my finger on the pulse here in the States. It's happening. I just saw an article where a chief up in Canada of a First Nation, the Spuzum Nation, is calling for their spectrum rights. It's happening in Guatemala with radio spectrum down there. And then, of course, everything that's happening with you guys. And so I am so excited to see how this plays out. I'm so excited to connect with you as someone who's got similar interests, and yeah, if there's any way that I can support you, please absolutely let me know. And I, of course, offer the same to you. But I just really want to thank you for talking to me today and for sharing so much of your knowledge. I think this is something that not a lot of people know about and not a lot of people are talking about, but something that affects all of us. And And that's so, so important and will be in perpetuity. So thank you for your work
Will
and thank
be.
you for what you do.
And, the next phase for us is really starting to explore 5G technologies. And we're really excited about it. We're going to be putting New Zealand's very first private 5G network up very shortly. It's just arrived this morning in the country, and we'll be setting that up in the next few weeks. So we're really keen now to also look at how can Indigenous peoples use these technologies, everything from IoT through to 5G, and use them for things that help solve real world problems for Maori and Maori businesses. We're really keen to do that. We're excited.
I love it. Well, I'll be following, and I'm a huge fan. And thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Antony Royal. Thank you. Kia
ora. No, kia ora.
That's it for this episode of Determi-Nation. I want to thank Antony one more time for sharing so much knowledge and time with us today. I also want to offer a big ahiha to the Shuttleworth Foundation, which made this episode possible. Our intro music today is Move I'm Indigenous by Aqualu Berthlison, and our outro music is Blue Sunrise by DJ Beso. Ahiha for listening, and until next time, hokone.